Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneur mindset and skills. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive.
We are extremely excited to have Eva Lau on the Venture for Canada podcast this afternoon. Eva, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show.
So Eva, before we started recording, we chatted a lot about the importance of resilience and how when you're an entrepreneur, there are inevitable ups and downs and challenges and setbacks, but also joys. What advice would you give an entrepreneur on how to cultivate resilience?
That's a great question. I think resilience, it's a trait that we need nowadays, not only entrepreneurs, but in general, in the population. The reason I said that is because certainly as the world continues to progress, there will be new technologies, new educations that we need to acquire. So have that kind of resilience to kind of like feel that, oh, I need to learn something new, or I need to try something different. Is a trait that is absolutely necessary. To build resilience, I think there are a few things that we have to have. I think, first of all, we've talked about it, Scott, that the very first thing we need to have or we need to do in order to build resilience is self-love. For me, as an Asian woman, born and raised, being in a very traditional Chinese family, sometimes we have self-doubts. We just kind of like, am I good enough? Am I doing the right thing? Do I get approval from others? And if we continue to have that kind of self-doubts and in a way torment ourselves with all these questions, it's extremely difficult to build resilience, because resilience only happens when we can basically stand up again after we fell down. So the very first thing I think to build resilience is to love yourself. Believe in yourself. Maybe believe in yourself not in an egoistic way saying, oh, I know it all, but believe yourself that you have the capability, the potential to be better. A step at a time, maybe even baby step at a time. And that's what we need the most to build resilience, is to love yourself and believe in yourself.
So we're 2 years into the pandemic, and over the last 2 years, there are millions, tens of millions of people around the world who've experienced grief. They've lost loved ones. They have suffered economically, socially, health-wise because of the pandemic. And grief is an interesting concept to think about, both in the context of the specific moment of history that we're in, but also in the context of entrepreneurship, to the point that people can grieve a failed business. They can grieve a failed initiative as part of a business. They can grieve a relationship with a business partner that's gone wrong. There's lots of ways I think grief interfaces with entrepreneurship in different kinds of ways. So Eva, what advice would you give an entrepreneur on how to cultivate a healthy relationship with grief?
Well, thanks for asking this question. So I experienced grief immensely when I lost my father many years ago. I graduated fresh out of university, and very shortly I lost my father due to cancer. And being the elder daughter of this very small family, the responsibility obviously fell on my shoulder. I don't think, now that I think about it, I don't think I had much time to grieve initially, because I have a mother who was grieving immensely at the time, losing the spouse. I have a younger sister that I have to take care of. So I just threw myself at work, making sure that we will be okay financially, making sure that my sister will be able to go on with school, with her mental health and things like that, making sure that my mother can continue to function in a way. So Was I grieving? I absolutely was grieving, but I did not necessarily have a mechanism to cope with it. So from time to time, I would be certainly burst into tears at night, just thinking about my father and how life would be if he were still there. So grieving, it's a process, and it's not like there are 4 steps, do these, and then we'll be done with. What I've learned from my experience is grieving. It's a lifelong process, because right now, after so many years losing my father, from time to time, I still find myself grieving for his absence in my life right now. Look, when I look at my children, I wish my father were here to just, hang out with them, maybe kind of like comment on how crazy they are these days. But those things just would never happen. So yes, I would catch myself grieving in those moments. But honestly, that grief dulls off over time. Time is really, the healing power when we're dealing with grief. So in the context of grieving a startup or grieving a failed project, the most important thing that we have to allow ourselves to feel is, yes, we are grieving. This is, we lost the company, or the company didn't work well. And yes, it's a loss, and it's very, very painful. But we have to have that kind of ability to have that inner peace and remain hopeful. Because, yes, I lost my father. I couldn't bring him back to life or anything. Yes, things will lost, you will lose things and never back to where they were. But we have to believe that we would be able to carry on life and continue to have a better life and continue to be able to do meaningful things. And, in the context of losing a loved ones, certainly they would want us to have a good life moving forward. So that's very important that we continue to do that. And in the context of losing a company, we have to believe that, we have the capability to do another one. Or, we have to have the belief that with our experience, we will be able to do something better, maybe something different, but we would have to believe that we will be okay coming from the other end.
Many entrepreneurs experience on a day-to-day basis significantly more stress than a typical person. They, between like letting people go or raising money or hiring or selling to clients, it can be just an onslaught of stress, as you know. And consequently, a lot of entrepreneurs have elevated levels of mental health challenges, but also in terms of challenges coping in unhealthy ways. So be it with drugs or alcohol or many other sort of non-productive ways in terms of how to cope. So on the topic of coping, that if you're under this stress, if you're dealing with things that can keep you up at night, and that where your decisions make a real impact on a lot of people's lives, and you make the wrong decision, it's not just you who potentially has a negative impact, it's hundreds of people. What advice do you have for entrepreneurs on how to develop coping mechanisms that allow them to healthily deal with this kind of stress?
I think in my professional journey, I found that to have a group of people around you that you trust and be able to speak confidentially and openly, that is the best way to cope with these kind of stress. So to give you a little bit more context, so Alan became a member of YPO, the Young President Organization, many years ago. And they have something called a forum. So a forum are basically putting all these founders or members from the YPO community together, and they basically learn and share their struggles with each other. They have a specific format of how to communicate so that it's not judgmental and also not necessarily giving advice, because giving advice is the cheapest way of communications, because, oh, you should do that. Oh, you should do that. But if it didn't work out, whose responsibility is it, right? So in a forum, the communication protocol it's always about sharing experience, be a sounding board. And Alan certainly enjoyed that forum very much. So he actually then introduced this concept in the tech community. So later, and that there comes the Founder City initiative many years ago. And I personally also benefit from a forum, meaning that I have a group of people that I trust, that I can speak confidentially, and most importantly, without judgment, and be able to support each other, at least as a sounding board or sharing experience so that we can draw life lessons from each other. So for founders, I know that it is a very lonely journey. When you're running out of money, when your spouse is like, why we have to get a second mortgage, or when you actually have to tell your kids, hey, you can no longer learn piano because I cannot afford to pay that. Those are very, very real life struggles that founders are dealing with. So being able to have that group of people to share experience, to how did you do it, or how did you even have that conversation with your spouse, it helps each other and support each other through the very painful process. So sometimes through grieving, but then also sometimes it's more about giving ideas, helping each other through the journey. So I would say that, to build that kind of support, it's very, very important in an entrepreneur journey. I think, the other coping mechanism is again, once again, allowing yourself to actually have those feelings and feel those feelings. Most importantly, recognize signs. So this is one thing that I think a lot of entrepreneurs may not necessarily realize that. So during the early days of Wattpad, when Alan and I were really struggling financially, we were at the verge of selling our house to continue to fund the journey. But one thing that Alan and I have decided very early on is to draw a line on the sand saying that, hey, if we ever reach this point, then we should not be doing this, Wattpad thing anymore. So same thing, when it comes to coping mechanism, you should actually be able to tell yourself, if I ever find myself doing this, that's a yellow flag that I should be aware of. Let's say I don't sleep more than 3 hours per night consecutively for a few weeks. That's a yellow sign or yellow flag, or maybe even a red flag, depending on how you actually defined it. But to be able to recognize these signs so that you know when to stop, not necessarily stop the venture, but stop yourself going into the rabbit hole. Or, being able to kind of tell yourself, you know what, this is a time I need to take a breather. I need to kind of like offload some of my responsibilities to some other people so that I can put myself back together. So being able to recognize those yellow flags, red flags is actually one of the most important coping mechanism with, to help you not to really get into that rabbit hole and go, in that downward spiral and have things spun out of control.
I think building on that, one of the things that's really important, I think, for people to do is create what are a list of like healthy coping mechanisms, like support group, Founder City Forum, or going on walks, or doing yoga, or talking to your friends on the phone. And then what are like the unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? Like at a certain point, to your point about yellow flags, like if somebody has a drink like 10 days in a row after work, right? At a certain point, is it okay? Right? Well, what role is alcohol beginning to play in that person's life? Or, right, if they're eating unhealthy food every single day, in what way is that being used as kind of like an emotional crutch to kind of help them through? But I think it's something that and it relates to a really important point about mindfulness, which I think is something that is integral for a lot of entrepreneurs, and self-awareness. That a sense of, okay, I'm not feeling great, or I'm beginning to pursue a kind of behavior that is very unhealthy and that gets me down the wrong path. And I'm saying now I'm not going to do that anymore. And it's interesting because a lot of studies on leadership and successful entrepreneurs show that one of the traits that most correlates with success is self-awareness. In essence, the more self-aware someone is of their foibles, of their strengths, of their weaknesses, of how they're feeling in general, the more successful that they're going to be. And I think in many ways in our modern society, we often don't like to feel difficult things. And I think it's even taught a lot in kids, like, don't feel angry, don't feel sad, don't feel grief. And the way that people run from those through unhealthy coping mechanisms. They try to blunt the pain. But part of being a successful, I think, entrepreneur and just a impactful person in general is, how do you develop the inner resources to really feel that sense of pain? And this relates to our previous conversation about grief as well. And I think partly it's about having healthy coping mechanisms and not using a coping mechanism in a way to escape from the really difficult feelings, because part of life, part of being an entrepreneur are those really difficult feelings.
Well, that certainly is a loaded question. But here's what I would have to say in terms of self-awareness. I think you're absolutely spot on. For any people who are going to be successful, I found them to be very self-aware, not self-conscious. That's a little bit of a different, right? Because self-conscious is like, oh, is my hair okay? Is my lipstick okay? You kind of like worry about your presentation of yourself. But self-aware is different. Self-aware is you look inside, understanding how you're feeling. Actually, this is a great thing. I was just through a workshop on leadership, and it talks about, from a psychological model perspective, is like how a person deal with things in life is very much like a person riding an elephant. So the riding part is is the logic part. We want to do it this way. We need to, get the elephant to go this direction. So we try to kind of like control things in a very logical way. But many of the times, our reaction, our feelings is very much like the elephant. We cannot really control because it's so big, right? So for us is to have that awareness of, how am I feeling? Why am I doing this? So for example, when you're saying coping mechanism, when you talk about eating unhealthy and all these kind of stuff, sometimes it's very obvious. Like when you're like so tired, you open up the fridge, get the 3-liter bucket out of the freezer of ice cream, and you kind of like binge eating it. That's very obviously, very, very unhealthy. But sometimes they are actually very subtle coping mechanism that I actually did not realize. Because I remember, during the early days of Wattpad, sometimes things get difficult, whether it comes to work or whatever. And I found myself angry. I found myself, having this kind of like negative feeling at me. And I found myself yelling at the kids. I found myself picking on things in the kitchen. Like, why is the fork over here? It should be in the drawer. Why are there so many dirty dishes in the sink? They should be in the dishwasher. So I find myself irritated. I find myself not the best Eva Lau. Then sometimes, it just kind of hits you. It's like, hold on a second. Why am I feeling it this way? Then all of a sudden, that is where your self-awareness kicked in. It's like, is it really about the dishes in the sink? Is it really about the fork on the counter and not in the drawer? Or is it because I am frustrated at work and I need to pick a fight to let that energy out? So self-awareness is, easier said than done, but it's very much like riding the elephant.
I am hopeful as well. And I think a lot of Gen Z, a lot of people in high school, university age are a lot more self-aware, and they're a lot more attuned to these kinds of things than even people of my generation. I'm 30. So I'm 10 years older than people who are in university now. And I find there's a big shift. There's a big shift around mental health, about being more self-aware. That certainly existed when I was in high school, and I graduated from high school in 2009. So I'm not that old. There were no conversations about mental health, none. And that was only in the span of history, 13 years ago. And it's amazing. It's interesting. I went back to my high school in October, and I spoke about mental health. I spoke about challenges I've experienced, about perfectionism, because the school I went to was had a I am definitely have perfectionist tendencies, and my school, in some ways promoted perfectionism, at least when I was there. And I spoke very bluntly about the need to kind of move away from perfectionism, mindset. And it's funny, I thought to myself, if I had gone back in 2007, 2008, this school would definitely not be having a speaker talking about the subject of perfectionism. Not at all. So one thing we talked about in the pre-show before we started recording was about inner calm and developing a sense of inner peace. Eva, what does inner peace look like to you?
I'm so glad you asked this question because I once asked this question myself. What does peace looks like? And this is what I've been told. So this story goes like this. There was a person asked, what is peace? Can somebody describe what peace looks like to me? So this person then asked 3 artists to draw a picture to describe how peace looks like. So one artist drew a picture of like beach and sand, blue sky, very peaceful. And then another person drew a picture of rolling hills, greeneries, very beautiful. And then the third person drew a picture of a storm. You can see the wind was so fierce. You can see the lightning at the background. The picture was so dark. So the person who commissioned the project asked, the artist, the third artist, is like, hold on a second. I can understand peace with this beach type of a picture. And I can certainly understand peace with the rolling hills. Why would this be peace? The artist said, come here, I'll show you. And then he brought the person closer to the picture and pointed on the picture, say, look. And there he found a bird nest with a bird and 2 chicks calmly sitting inside a nest. That's peace. So peace doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory, that you can enjoy and relax. Peace actually means that even during the most difficult time, you know that there's hope after. It's just kind of like in the midst of a storm. You know the sun is really behind the dark clouds. That's peace.
I recently finished reading Anna Karenina a couple months ago, and it's interesting. The last chapter of Anna Karenina, which I highly recommend readers listen. And by the way, people understand how this links to what Eva said in a minute. But at the end of Anna Karenina, Levin, who's one of the main characters, he grapples through much of the novel with a sort of sense of what's the purpose of life, of what's the purpose of suffering. There's all this suffering going on. He's living in 19th century Russia, and eventually he kind of reaches this kind of philosophical conclusion, which is to say that the unknown is unknown, that it's this sort of sense of just like inner calm and peace, and recognizing that there's so much that we don't know, and there's so much that we can never know. And it's just having that sort of sense of faith, which is in essence, he talks about at the end. And I think that one of the things that I have observed with a lot of people who, at least on the outside, seem very happy, they seem very kind of calm, is a sense of just sort of a deep acceptance of there's so much we don't know about our existence, about who we are, and that's okay, and just kind of having a sense of faith. And one of the things we talked about, Eva, was how your faith has kind of impacted you as a person. And I think faith for listeners can be many different ways. It can be faith in terms of religion, whether someone's Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or many other faiths. But it can also be a philosophical kind of operating system. I think faith exists, the atheists can have a sense of faith in different ways. So focusing on you, Eva, in what ways has your faith helped cultivate that sense of calm, that comfortness with the unknown?
Thank you for asking. Not a lot of people ask me this question, but I'm more than happy to share my personal faith. So as you put it, Scott, everyone's faith journey is different. So for my specific one, I'm a born again Christian. So for me, how did it help me in this journey or in my life in general is, in the context of Christianity, I knew that I'm cherished. And so is everyone else. They are cherished. So to come back to the point of suffering or struggles, I certainly wouldn't say that my life has been struggling, but I certainly would not, disagree that my life was full of challenges. Uh, Middle class, with working parent, particularly my dad was working. My mom was a housewife, and lost my father when I graduated university. And woman engineer working in an all men's world. Building Wattpad was certainly not easy during the early days. I can count many, many of these kind of moments that I felt I was really struggling. So to a point that struggles sometimes make us feel very weak because we thought we were hopeless. We thought we were worthless, or sometimes that we are of no good. And sometimes, when we suffer too much, we may feel that we're damaged goods. But my journey have always allowed me to go back to the point that I'm cherished. I'm worth it. And I was just also saying that, in our pre-show that we talked about, how do you kind of like go through journey when life is not easy and when we struggle along, many times. And I'm not trying to make light of those situations because there are actually people who are living a very, struggling life. However, what I have learned in my life is that no matter how struggling, how challenging our lives are or were, there will absolutely be moments that we have happiness. For example, maybe someone grew up in a very poor family and they were being neglected by their parents because they were, working. I bet you maybe you have a neighbor or a sibling that you actually have joy playing with when you were growing up. Or maybe you're really struggling in your career, seems like everyone have wronged you, or seems like doors and opportunities didn't come your way. But I bet you there must be at least one colleague that you can relate to and forge great friendship. Or maybe there's a skill that, yes, I may not necessarily have a lot of career opportunities here, but you know what? I now know this industry inside out. I have got some technical skill that I can move on. So as long as we focus on what we call pearl moments, every good moments, we looked at it as if a nice piece of pearl. As we string them together, we'll end up having a beautiful pearl necklace. See, I'm a woman, so that's why I use these kind of analogies. So I don't know what men collect, but women certainly wants to collect pearls and make a pearl necklace. Maybe Scott, you can add some color. What would men do if they're not pearl necklaces?
I don't know, probably, yeah, cufflinks. I don't know. There can be a lot of different ties for some, although I feel like ties with cufflinks are less common today than 10 to 15 years ago.
Maybe it's your sneaker collections then.
Yeah, sneaker. I have a cousin who's a big sneaker collector. He has like 50. So yeah, sneaker could be the next kind of stage. And it's an interesting, I think, as we think about suffering 2 years into the pandemic. And one of the things I've thought about a little bit is the extent to which I think suffering too connects us to other humans. It's part of what makes us human, that it is our shared suffering that ultimately, and I think of Man's Search for Meaning, and there's a preface written by a rabbi, and the rabbi lost one of his children. And I think the experience, I've never lost a child, but the experience I imagine of losing a child as a parent is probably one of the most emotionally intense things that somebody can go through in their lifetime. And he talks about the deep grieving, the immense loss of having this child pass away, but how through that experience, it gave him a deeper sense of inner reserve and empathy and compassion for those in his congregation going through intense challenges. And that at the end of the day, he got a sense of meaning kind of through it. And I think it's an interesting thing for us to think about is that to live is to suffer in some way. That's not to say everything is suffering, but an integral part of our human existence is suffering. And the extent to which suffering can yes, there's that point of thinking of the good memories, thinking of, okay, these are all the pearls. But I think there's also that point of thinking about what is the benefit of suffering in and of itself, and how is suffering part of our human existence, and how does it make it potentially help us be a better people?
An awesome question. And I think, in the context of, a human being, and also in the context of an entrepreneur, I think this is a very, very important question. Because, sometimes when we're in the midst of our struggles, we're like, why me? Why me? Why is this happening? Right. So a lot of people will focus that on building, strength and resilience of a person. So a lot of people will use this example of like, think about a butterfly. They build, they are struggling from within the cocoon and they have to get out. So they are like struggling the wings like that, right? So everyone understand that picture, because the end result of going through the cocoon of like struggling is to spread out your wings and become beautiful, right? So everybody understand that. So that's given. But one thing I actually have learned through my own journey of taking on challenges and struggle is to be able to build that empathy and also being able to help others. So imagine me right now as a VC. I write checks to startups. So when the founders describe to me how they are struggling or things like that, I can easily go switch to the other side of the table and see from their end, because I have been there. So when they are telling me that they didn't get helpful advice or they're really struggling, that I know what do I need to do to help that person. Sometimes just by giving words of encouragement, but sometimes it's really kind of like, what, this is how I feel, or this is what I can do to help you, because I've been to the other side of the table. Same thing, I've lost my father, when I was young. So I knew when someone come to me and say, hey, look, Eva, I'm struggling right now because my father is very sick. I'm like, I know exactly how it feels. And I will be able to tell stories and lessons as a person. So now in the context of a startup, this is definitely inevitable, because, we were saying in our pre-recording that to become an extremely successful company, or with the perhaps unicorn status, it's like 0.001 or maybe 0.000. I don't know how many zero you have to put in to become that one. So what that means is a lot of the people will not get there. So when there are tech accelerators or other investor ask me like, what's your thought in terms of such kind of successful rate, isn't that very, very hard? I say absolutely. But you know what, for every one failure, those startups would become what I call corpse in the ecosystem. But guess what? They're going to turn into fertilizers. They're going to go through the whole carbon cycle.
One of the themes of this kind of interview has been about mental health and the importance of mental health. And I think in particular, this relates to entrepreneurship. And I've interviewed dozens of people for the Venture for Canada podcast, and I really appreciate your candor, Eva, because I think that often the mental health challenges of entrepreneurs are things that are very unspoken, that a lot of entrepreneurs don't feel comfortable speaking about it. And it's been interesting. I participate in a Founder City Forum group, and I have for like 2 years. And it's one of the things where I began to appreciate that, like, there's around 10 people in the group, and pretty much most of the people at some point in the 2 years we've regularly spoken have gone through challenges. There have been tears. There have been intense hardship that people have kind of gone through. And it's been interesting kind of going through it, and just to sort of say that I actually think a really common, or I think it's something that pretty much every entrepreneur goes through, even the ones who are, I mean, I don't personally know necessarily people running multi-billion-dollar companies, but I think even I can imagine somebody like Dax da Silva going through Lightspeed and the challenges Lightspeed's had. I imagine right now it's probably not an easy time. I mean, I don't know him personally, but I can imagine even when you get to that level, that there are moments of really intense sort of self-reflection and struggle and hardship. And it's so important, I think, for entrepreneurs to think about mental health and to build these kind of support systems and to have these kind of candid conversations. And I appreciate you, Eva, because both in this interview and I think a lot of other interviews that I did in terms of research, is your candor, your honesty. I think your courage to talk about mental health sets a really important precedent for other people to talk about mental health. and I think makes a real impact in entrepreneurs seeking the kinds of resources that they need to feel better, to seeking the kind of support, to pursuing the kind of healthy coping mechanisms that they need. So I just want to say thank you for everything that you do.
Well, it's my pleasure. And, that's what I meant, every struggle or, in some strong words, sufferings, there's a meaning. Because if I had not been to, a struggling position when Alan was building Wattpad, I wouldn't be able to share these struggles with you. At the same time, when we were building, the largest consumer internet company here in Canada, literally building a social media platform for storytelling without a blueprint, I certainly shed a lot of tears and sweat and to some degree, blood. And without those lessons, I wouldn't be able to kind of share the war scars and help nurture the next generation of entrepreneurs. When I was in the midst of it, would I have understand that? Obviously not. I was just literally fighting battles and battles and kind of like making things work. And then I would call it a win of the day. But little did I know that since 2009 and now to 2022, my experience could be a support in the ecosystem. So it's one of your philosopher that you talked about is like, what we don't know, we don't know. And hindsight is always 2020, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I think to your point, it's why it's so important that venture capitalists and angel investors have the lived experience, I think, of building companies, that having the actual experience of going through the challenges an entrepreneur faces, I think makes somebody that much more effective as a venture capitalist. Because when you're a venture capitalist, it's so much more than just writing a check. It's about really championing the entrepreneur, giving advice to the entrepreneur. And it's really tough to do that if you haven't actually gone through the lived experience of entrepreneurship like yourself.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. For us, building a startup, it's really much like, giving birth to a baby and raise it to become an adult. And it could be extremely close to an entrepreneur's heart. And if we don't respect that relationship, it could be difficult. But then the difference is still at the end of the day, a business. So it's extremely also important for founders to understand that whoever investing in your company is just very much like what I call the in-laws, meaning that we both want the baby to grow healthy and become big and strong and successful. But at the end of the day, you are the parent. So make this relationship work.
That is a great analogy. Eva, it has been a true pleasure speaking with you. We've covered a wide range of topics, including a lot of very intense ones, and I appreciate your candor talking about grief and suffering and the importance of lived entrepreneurial experiences as an investor, how to cultivate a sense of resilience. I think that these are topics that it is critical for all entrepreneurs to think about, to reflect on, but also for all people. That life is not necessarily easy. It very rarely is. It's full of ups and downs and curveballs. And I think the practical advice that you gave and the philosophical advice you gave is something that's really helpful for entrepreneurs to think about. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me. I certainly hope that, my journey as a person and my journey as an entrepreneur and my journey as a VC can be helpful to the larger community out there.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stirrett, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Juanita Lee Garcia and Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided, stated by our guests and our host, is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.